Welcome to Wonderful Stories, a place where imagination comes alive. So let's begin.
Part 1: The Promise. Seabrook was the kind of town where nothing ever changed. The same fishing boats returned to the harbor every evening. The same old bakery opened at sunrise. And the same quiet train station stood at the edge of town, where only a few trains stopped each day before disappearing toward the distant cities. For most people, Seabrook was home. But for Brandon and Joshua, it always felt like a cage. They had grown up side by side. Their houses were only 3 streets apart, and from the time they were children, they were rarely seen without each other. Joshua was the kind of boy everyone noticed. His laughter was loud, his smile fearless, and his energy seemed endless. He had messy dark hair that never stayed in place and eyes that sparkled with mischief. Brandon was different, quiet, thoughtful. The kind of boy who spoke only when necessary, but when he did, people listened. Despite their differences, they fit together perfectly. Joshua pulled Brandon into adventures. Brandon kept Joshua grounded. It had always been that way. When they were younger, they spent their summers exploring the cliffs by the ocean, racing bicycles through empty streets, and sneaking into the abandoned lighthouse at the edge of town. But as they grew older, something began to change. Their friendship slowly deepened into something neither of them could fully explain. Something unspoken. Something dangerous. One warm summer night when they were 17, the 2 boys climbed onto the roof of Joshua's house like they had done 100 times before. The sky above Seabrook was clear, filled with endless stars. Joshua leaned back on his hands and looked up at the sky. "Do you ever feel like you're meant for something bigger?" he asked suddenly. Brandon glanced at him. "What do you mean?" Joshua gestured toward the distant horizon. "This town is too small. Everyone here just stays. They grow up, get jobs, get married, and never leave." He paused. "I don't want that." Brandon watched the wind move through Joshua's hair. "And what do you want?" he asked quietly. Joshua turned toward him, eyes glowing with excitement. "I want to leave." Brandon felt his heart skip. "Leave?" Joshua nodded eagerly. "There's a train that leaves the station every night at midnight. It goes to the capital city." Brandon frowned slightly. "You've been thinking about this a lot." Joshua grinned. "Of course I have." Then his expression softened. "What if we left together?" The words hung in the air between them. Brandon stared at him. "Together?" Joshua nodded. "We could start over somewhere else. No parents controlling our lives. No expectations. Just us." The idea felt impossible, but also strangely perfect. Brandon looked down at the quiet town below them. For years, he had dreamed about escaping this place, but he had never imagined doing it with someone. Until now, Joshua suddenly reached out and grabbed Brandon's wrist. "Let's do it." Brandon blinked. "What?" Joshua's voice was serious now. "Next week, midnight, at the train station." Brandon's heart began to race. "Joshua." Joshua squeezed his hand. "Come with me." There was a strange intensity in Joshua's eyes. For a moment, Brandon forgot how to breathe. He realized something then. If Joshua asked him to jump off the roof, he probably would. Brandon let out a quiet breath. "Okay." Joshua's eyes widened. "Wait, really?" Brandon nodded. "Yes." Joshua broke into the brightest smile Brandon had ever seen. "Then it's a promise." He held out his pinky finger like they were still children. Brandon hesitated for a moment, then hooked his pinky with Joshua's. "Midnight," Joshua said. "Midnight," Brandon repeated. Neither of them noticed how close they were sitting now. The wind carried the scent of the ocean across the rooftops. Joshua suddenly spoke again, quieter this time. "Brandon." "Yes." Joshua hesitated. Then he said something that would change everything. "If you don't show up." Brandon frowned. "I will." Joshua shook his head slightly. "That's not what I mean." His voice grew softer. "If one of us doesn't show up, we don't look for each other again." Brandon stared at him. "That's a strange rule." Joshua forced a smile. "It just makes the promise more serious." Brandon studied his face. Something about Joshua's expression felt uncertain. But Brandon nodded anyway. Fine. Joshua leaned back again and looked at the stars. 7 days, he said. 7 days until they would leave Seabrook forever. 7 days until their lives would change. Neither of them knew it yet, but only one of them would be standing at the train station that night. Part 2: The night at the train station. The days leading up to their escape passed both too quickly and painfully slow. For Brandon, every moment felt heavy with anticipation. Every ordinary thing suddenly felt like it might be the last time he experienced it. The last walk past the old bakery. The last sunset over Seabrook's harbor. The last time hearing the distant whistle of the midnight train. He began packing in secret. A small backpack. Nothing more. A few clothes. Some money he had saved for years. And a photograph. It was an old photo taken when he and Joshua were 12 years old. They stood on the beach with the ocean behind them, their faces sunburned and laughing. Joshua had his arm thrown around Brandon's shoulders. At the time, it had just been a memory. Now it felt like something much more important. Meanwhile, Joshua acted completely normal. Too normal. At school, he joked with friends, skipped classes like usual, and spent afternoons playing basketball behind the gym. But sometimes Brandon caught strange expressions crossing Joshua's face. Moments where his smile faded too quickly. Moments where he looked like he was thinking about something he didn't want to say. Brandon didn't ask. Maybe he was afraid of the answer. Finally, the 7th day arrived. The day of the promise. Brandon barely slept the night before. His mind was filled with images of the future. The capital city. New streets. New lives. A place where they could be whoever they wanted. A place where nobody knew them. A place where Brandon could finally stop pretending that Joshua was only his best friend. The day passed slowly. Dinner with his parents felt strangely quiet. His mother talked about small things. His father discussed work like always. Neither of them knew their son was planning to disappear that night. When the clock reached 11:20 p.m., Brandon quietly stood up from his bed. His backpack was already waiting. He slipped out of the house through the back door, careful not to make noise. The night air was cool. The streets were empty. Brandon walked quickly toward the train station. Each step made his heart beat faster. He kept checking the time on his phone. 11:36 p.m. 11:42 p.m. 11:48 p.m. The old train station appeared at the end of the street. The building was small and mostly deserted at night. Only a few dim lights illuminated the platform. The midnight train was scheduled to arrive in 10 minutes. Brandon stepped onto the platform and waited. The wind moved through the empty station. The silence felt enormous. Brandon checked the time again. 11:52 p.m. Joshua wasn't there yet. But that didn't worry him. Joshua was always late. Brandon leaned against one of the metal pillars and watched the empty entrance of the station. Any moment now, Joshua would come running down the street with that same reckless grin, apologizing for being late, laughing like this was the most exciting adventure of their lives. 11:56 p.m. The train whistle echoed faintly in the distance. Brandon's heart jumped. Still no Joshua. He pulled out his phone. No messages. No calls. 11:58 p.m. The sound of the approaching train grew louder. Brandon's stomach tightened. Maybe Joshua was running. Maybe he was just a minute away. Brandon stared at the station entrance. Waiting. Waiting. 11:59 p.m. The train lights appeared in the distance. Still no Joshua. For the first time, a cold feeling spread through Brandon's chest. He stepped away from the pillar and walked closer to the entrance. Maybe he just couldn't see him yet. Maybe. The train pulled into the station with a loud metallic screech. The doors opened. Passengers began stepping off. Others boarded quickly. Brandon didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the entrance. Joshua still wasn't there. A quiet voice echoed over the platform speakers. Final boarding. Brandon felt his chest tighten painfully. He checked his phone again. Nothing. No message. No explanation. The train conductor blew the whistle. Last call. Brandon's mind began racing. Maybe something happened. Maybe Joshua got caught by his parents. Maybe, maybe he had simply changed his mind. Brandon clenched his hands. No, Joshua wouldn't do that. He wouldn't break the promise. Right? The train doors began to close. For a moment, Brandon almost stepped forward. He could still board. He could still leave. But his feet wouldn't move. Because Joshua had made a rule. If one of them didn't show up, they wouldn't look for each other again. The doors shut with a loud click. The train slowly began to move. Brandon stood frozen on the platform as the train pulled away from the station. Its lights faded into the darkness. And just like that, the chance to leave Seabrook disappeared. The station became silent again. Empty. Cold. Brandon stood there for a long time. Minutes passed. Maybe even hours. Eventually, he sat down on one of the benches. His backpack slipped from his shoulders. The weight in his chest felt unbearable. He stared at the empty entrance one last time. Joshua never came. No explanation. No goodbye. Nothing. The promise they made under the stars was broken, and Brandon realized something painful. Maybe Joshua had never intended to leave with him at all. The thought hurt more than anything else. That night, something inside Brandon quietly shattered, and the silence between them would last 7 long years. Part 3: The Boy Who Never Came. The night Brandon waited at the train station became the night everything changed. For days afterward, Seabrook felt different to him. Smaller, quieter, colder. It was the same town he had lived in his entire life, yet now it felt like a place filled with ghosts. Every street reminded him of Joshua. The basketball court behind the school. The small cafe where Joshua always ordered milkshakes. The old lighthouse they used to climb when they were younger. Everywhere Brandon looked, memories followed him. But Joshua was gone. At first, Brandon expected some kind of explanation. A message. A call. Anything. He checked his phone constantly. Nothing came. At school, Joshua's desk was empty. The first day, Brandon assumed Joshua was sick. The second day, people began whispering. By the third day, rumors had spread through the entire school. Joshua had left Seabrook. No one seemed to know exactly when or how. Some said his father had suddenly transferred him to another city. Others said his family had moved because of business problems. But nobody had a clear answer. And Joshua never contacted Brandon. Not once. Felt like he had simply disappeared. The betrayal cut deeper than Brandon ever expected. For years, Joshua had been the most important person in his life. The one person who understood him. The one person he trusted more than anyone else. And yet, Joshua had been the one to break their promise. Brandon tried to convince himself it didn't matter. People leave. People change. But the silence hurt more than the broken promise. Because if Joshua had just sent one message, one explanation, maybe Brandon could have understood. Instead, he was left with nothing but questions. And slowly, those questions turned into something darker. Resentment. Weeks passed. Then months. Brandon buried himself in studying. He worked harder than he ever had before. If Joshua had chosen to disappear, then Brandon would simply move forward without him. He applied to universities in the capital city. Ironically, the same city they once planned to run away to together. This time, Brandon went alone. When he left Seabrook for college, he didn't look back. He didn't visit the train station again. He didn't return to the lighthouse. And he threw the photograph of the two of them into the bottom of a drawer where he wouldn't have to see it. Years passed. Brandon changed. The quiet boy from Seabrook grew into a sharp, determined young man. He studied business and economics, graduating at the top of his class. His natural intelligence and calm leadership quickly attracted attention from powerful companies. By the age of 24, Brandon had already built a reputation as one of the most promising young executives in the industry. People described him as cold, focused, unshakable. They admired his ambition, but none of them knew the truth. The truth was that Brandon had learned something important the night Joshua didn't show up. Never rely on anyone. Never trust promises. And never give someone the power to hurt you again. Meanwhile, Joshua's life had taken a completely different path. On the night he was supposed to meet Brandon at the train station, Joshua had been ready. His bag was packed. His heart was racing with excitement. He had planned everything. He even wrote a note for his parents explaining why he was leaving. But just as he was about to sneak out of the house, everything fell apart. Joshua's father discovered the bag. The argument that followed was explosive. His father had always been strict, but that night his anger was something Joshua had never seen before. "You're leaving with him?" his father demanded. Joshua froze. "How do you know?" "Because I read the message on your phone." Joshua felt his stomach drop. His father held up the phone, his expression dark. The train station at midnight. Joshua tried to grab the phone, but his father pulled it away. "You're not going anywhere." Joshua's chest tightened. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." His father's voice was ice cold. "You think you're running away to the city with that boy." Joshua clenched his fists. "He's not just that boy." That was when his father said something that would haunt Joshua for years. "If you leave this house tonight," his father said slowly, "you will never see your family again." The words hung in the air. Joshua felt trapped. If he stayed, he would break his promise to Brandon. But if he left, he would lose everything. His mother, his sister, his home. And then his father made one final decision. The next morning, Joshua was forced onto a flight to another city. No goodbyes. No explanations. His phone was taken away. And the first thing his father did after they landed was change Joshua's number. Just like that, Joshua lost all contact with Brandon. Days passed. Joshua tried everything to reach him, but he had no way of contacting Brandon. No number, no address, nothing. And then he remembered the rule they made that night on the rooftop. If one of them didn't show up, they wouldn't look for each other again. Joshua realized Brandon would probably believe he had simply broken the promise. The thought crushed him. But the worst part was knowing Brandon must have waited for him. Alone, at the train station, Joshua never forgot that image. For 7 years, the memory followed him everywhere. 7 years of regret. 7 years of silence. And 7 years of wondering whether Brandon still hated him. Until the day fate finally brought them face to face again. But this time, they weren't childhood friends anymore. They were rivals. Part 4, 7 years later. 7 years later, the capital city looked exactly like the future Brandon once dreamed about. Towering skyscrapers reflected the sunlight across endless streets of glass and steel. Expensive cars filled the roads. Powerful corporations competed for influence and profit. It was a city built on ambition, and Brandon had become one of its rising stars. At 24, Brandon was already a senior executive at one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the country. His sharp instincts and calm decision-making had helped his company win several high-profile acquisitions. In the business world, people had started to recognize his name, Brandon Lee, the young strategist who rarely lost a deal. He was respected, admired, and feared. Inside the sleek conference room on the 42nd floor of Sterling Financial Group, Brandon sat quietly at the long glass table. Across from him sat several members of his company's executive board. A massive screen displayed the details of an upcoming contract. It was the biggest opportunity of the year. A major technology company was selling its controlling shares, and several powerful firms were competing to acquire it. Winning this contract would mean millions of dollars. But more importantly, it would establish dominance in the market. One of the senior directors leaned forward. "Our biggest competition will be Aurora Holdings." Brandon's eyes lifted slightly. Aurora Holdings. He had heard of them. They were a relatively new company but had grown quickly over the past few years. Their aggressive business strategies had surprised many people in the industry. The director continued speaking. "Their lead negotiator is known for being difficult." Another executive chuckled. "Difficult is putting it lightly." Brandon closed the folder in front of him. "What's his name?" he asked calmly. The director glanced down at his notes. "Joshua Hahn." The name hit Brandon like a sudden shock. For a moment he thought he had misheard. Joshua. Couldn't be. Joshua was a common name. There were thousands of people with that name. But something about hearing it made Brandon's chest tighten. He forced himself to stay calm. "Do we have any background on him?" The director nodded. "Top graduate from one of the best universities in the country. Joined Aurora Holdings shortly after. Became their youngest executive at 23. He paused. "And apparently, he's never lost a negotiation." A small smile appeared on Brandon's lips. "Neither have I." The meeting continued, but Brandon's thoughts drifted. Joshua Hahn. The name kept repeating in his mind. Couldn't be the same Joshua. The boy from Seabrook wouldn't suddenly appear in the corporate world like this, right? A few days later, the official bidding conference arrived. Executives from several companies gathered inside a luxury hotel ballroom where the negotiations would take place. The atmosphere was tense. Business deals worth millions were decided in rooms like this. Brandon adjusted the sleeve of his dark suit as he stepped inside. His expression was calm, unreadable. He walked toward the conference table with quiet confidence. Executives from various companies were already seated. But one chair remained empty. Aurora Holdings. Brandon sat down across from it. Minutes passed. Then the door opened. A man walked into the room. The moment Brandon looked up, time seemed to freeze. The man looked older now. Taller. More mature. His messy teenage hair was now neatly styled. His sharp suit fit perfectly, and his confident posture commanded attention. But those eyes, Brandon would recognize them anywhere. Joshua. 7 years had passed. 7 years of silence. And now the boy who never came to the train station was standing only a few feet away. Joshua stopped walking the moment he saw him. For a brief second, the confident executive mask on Joshua's face cracked. Shock flashed in his eyes. Brandon. The name slipped out before he could stop himself. The room fell silent. Several executives glanced between them in confusion. Brandon's expression didn't change, but inside, his heart was pounding. He slowly stood up. The distance between them felt impossibly small. 7 years ago, Brandon had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Sometimes he imagined shouting. Sometimes he imagined demanding answers. Sometimes he imagined simply walking away. But now that Joshua was standing in front of him, he felt nothing. Or at least that's what he told himself. Brandon extended his hand across the table. His voice was calm, professional, cold. "Nice to meet you," he said. "Mr. Hahn." Joshua stared at his hand. For a moment he couldn't move, because Brandon's eyes held no warmth, no recognition, just distance. Finally, Joshua slowly shook his hand. "Nice to meet you too," he replied quietly. "Mr. Lee." The handshake lasted only a second, but it felt like a lifetime. The meeting began shortly after. Executives presented proposals, financial strategies, and acquisition plans. But the real tension in the room wasn't the contract. It was the silent war between Brandon and Joshua. Every time Joshua spoke, Brandon watched him carefully. Every time Brandon presented an argument, Joshua challenged it. Their rivalry was immediate, sharp, intense. Neither of them gave the other an inch. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that only 2 companies remained serious contenders for the contract: Sterling Financial and Aurora Holdings, which meant Brandon and Joshua would have to face each other again. After the meeting ended, most executives left the room. Brandon gathered his documents calmly. Joshua remained standing near the table. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Finally, Joshua said quietly, "You've changed." Brandon didn't look at him. "So have you." Joshua hesitated. "Brandon, about that night." Brandon cut him off immediately. His voice was cold enough to stop Joshua mid-sentence. "That was 7 years ago." He finally looked at him. His eyes were unreadable. "It doesn't matter anymore." But Joshua could see the truth hidden behind Brandon's calm expression. Because even after 7 years, the silence between them still hurt. Part 5: The Rivalry. After the bidding conference, the entire business world began paying attention. 2 powerful companies, 2 young executives, and 1 massive contract. Sterling Financial and Aurora Holdings had become the final competitors in the acquisition deal, and the negotiations would continue over the next several weeks. But for Brandon and Joshua, the competition was far more personal. 7 years of silence now stood between them, and neither of them knew how to cross it. The next negotiation meeting was scheduled 2 days later. This time, the meeting took place in Aurora Holdings headquarters. The building itself was a statement of power. A sleek glass tower in the center of the financial district, with floors filled with modern offices and advanced technology. Brandon arrived exactly on time. His expression was calm as always, professional, unshakable. But inside, his thoughts were far from steady. He hadn't expected to see Joshua again after all these years. He certainly hadn't expected Joshua to become his biggest business rival. When Brandon stepped into the conference room, Joshua was already there. He stood near the large window overlooking the city skyline. For a moment, Brandon almost saw the boy he once knew. The same posture, the same distant look while staring at the horizon. But when Joshua turned around, the moment disappeared. Now he looked like a completely different person. Confident, sharp, dangerous in negotiations. Joshua gave a small polite nod. "Mr. Lee." Brandon returned the nod. "Mr. Han." Their voices were formal, carefully controlled, like two strangers who had never shared a childhood together. The meeting began. Lawyers, financial analysts, and company representatives filled the room. Documents were exchanged. Strategies were debated. Every proposal Brandon presented was immediately challenged by Joshua. And every argument Joshua made was dismantled by Brandon. It was like watching two master chess players. Each move calculated, each response precise. At one point, one of the senior investors leaned back in his chair and whispered to another executive, "These two are terrifying," because neither Brandon nor Joshua showed any hesitation. Neither of them wanted to lose, and neither of them wanted to show weakness in front of the other. After several hours, the meeting finally ended. The other executives began leaving the room, but Brandon stayed behind, organizing his documents. Joshua watched him quietly. Finally, when the last person left the room, the silence became heavy. Joshua walked closer. "Brandon." Brandon didn't look up. "What is it, Mr. Han?" Joshua sighed softly. "You don't have to call me that." Brandon closed his folder. "I think it's appropriate." Joshua studied him carefully. The Brandon he remembered had always been quiet and gentle. But the man standing in front of him now was colder, harder, like someone who had built walls around himself. Joshua spoke again. "You hate me." It wasn't a question. Brandon finally looked up. For a moment, something flashed in his eyes, but it disappeared quickly. "Hate is a strong word." Joshua let out a small laugh. "Then what is it?" Brandon stared at him. Then he said calmly, "You broke a promise." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. Joshua's expression changed. "Brandon, that night wasn't. You didn't come." Brandon's voice remained calm. Too calm. Joshua opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come out. Because Brandon was right. He hadn't come. Brandon continued quietly, "You told me if one of us didn't show up, we wouldn't look for each other again." Joshua lowered his gaze. "I remember." "Then you know the rule." Joshua clenched his hands. "I didn't have a choice." Brandon's expression hardened. "Everyone has a choice." Joshua looked up suddenly. "You think I just decided not to go?" Brandon didn't answer, but his silence said everything. Joshua felt frustration rising in his chest. "You waited at the station, didn't you?" Brandon's eyes flickered slightly. Joshua continued softly, "How long?" Brandon didn't respond, but the silence told Joshua the truth. Joshua looked away toward the window. For 7 years, he had imagined that moment. Brandon standing alone on the empty platform, waiting. Joshua spoke quietly. "I tried to come." Brandon let out a short breath. "That doesn't matter anymore." Joshua looked back at him. "It matters to me." Brandon picked up his briefcase. "Then that's your problem." He walked toward the door, but before leaving, he stopped. Without turning around, he said one last thing. "I kept my promise." Then he walked out of the room, leaving Joshua standing there alone. That night, Brandon sat alone in his apartment. The city lights glowed outside his window, but his mind kept returning to the same memory. The train station, the empty platform, the sound of the train leaving. He thought he had buried that night long ago, but seeing Joshua again had reopened everything. Meanwhile, across the city, Joshua sat in his own office. He stared at the old photograph he had kept hidden for 7 years. 2 boys standing on a beach, laughing. Joshua whispered quietly, "I'm sorry," but the person he needed to hear those words from him might never forgive him. Part 6. The truth begins to surface. The rivalry between Sterling Financial and Aurora Holdings quickly became the talk of the business world. Industry news articles began covering the ongoing negotiation like it was a strategic war. 2 companies, 2 young executives, and 1 contract that could change the balance of power in the market. But behind the headlines and polished business suits, the real battle was far more complicated. Because Brandon and Joshua were not just rivals. They were 2 people carrying the weight of the same unfinished past. 3 days after the last meeting, an unexpected complication appeared. The technology company they were trying to acquire announced a sudden change in the negotiation structure. Instead of choosing a company based only on proposals, they would require the final 2 competitors to participate in a joint strategy evaluation project. It was a temporary partnership. For 1 week, both companies would have to cooperate and design a growth plan together. After that, the company would decide which firm deserved the final contract. The announcement shocked everyone. Executives from both companies protested immediately, but the decision was final. And that meant one thing: Brandon and Joshua would be forced to work together. The next morning, Brandon arrived at the project meeting room with his usual calm expression. But when he heard the new rules from the board representatives, his jaw tightened slightly. Across the table, Joshua looked just as surprised. One of the board members explained the situation. "We want to see how both firms handle collaboration under pressure." Another member added, "Think of this as a test of leadership." Brandon remained silent, but inside he was already calculating the situation. Working with Joshua would be difficult, but losing the contract was not an option. Joshua spoke first. "When does the project start?" "Immediately," the board member replied. 7 days. 7 days. Brandon almost laughed at the irony. 7 years of silence. And now 7 days of forced cooperation. That afternoon, Brandon and Joshua sat alone in a smaller conference room to begin planning. A large digital screen displayed charts, market reports, and growth projections. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Brandon broke the silence. "Let's keep this professional." Joshua nodded. "Agreed." Brandon began outlining the strategy. His voice was steady and precise. Joshua listened carefully. And despite everything that had happened between them, Joshua couldn't help noticing something. Brandon had become incredible. His ideas were sharp, innovative, and incredibly detailed. This was not the quiet boy Joshua remembered. This was someone powerful, someone confident, someone who had built himself into a force in the business world. Joshua suddenly smiled faintly. "You always were the smart one." Brandon didn't react. "Focus on the project." Joshua raised his hands slightly. "All right." They continued working. Hours passed. To their surprise, the collaboration actually began to work. Brandon handled long-term strategy. Joshua excelled at risk analysis and negotiations. Their skills complemented each other perfectly, just like they had when they were younger. At one point, Joshua leaned back in his chair. "You know something?" Brandon glanced at him. "What?" Joshua gestured toward the screen. "We make a good team." Brandon's expression remained unreadable. "We're not a team." Joshua sighed softly. Still stubborn. Brandon ignored the comment. But inside, something about working with Joshua again felt strangely familiar. Dangerously familiar. As the evening approached, most employees had already left the building. The office floor grew quiet. Only Brandon and Joshua remained in the conference room. Joshua stretched his arms. We've been working for 6 hours. Brandon checked the time. Joshua stood up and walked toward the coffee machine in the corner. You want one? Brandon hesitated, then nodded slightly. Joshua handed him a cup. For a moment their fingers brushed. Both of them froze briefly. 7 years ago, that simple contact wouldn't have meant anything. But now, felt different. Joshua cleared his throat. Brandon, can we talk? Brandon took a slow sip of coffee. We are talking. Joshua shook his head. You know what I mean. Brandon stared at the table. For a moment, the room felt heavy again. Finally, Joshua spoke quietly. That night, at the train station, Brandon's hand tightened around the coffee cup. Joshua continued carefully. My father found out about our plan. Brandon looked up slowly. Joshua's voice was calm, but there was pain behind it. He took my phone. I couldn't contact you. Brandon's eyes narrowed slightly. Joshua continued. He forced me onto a flight the next morning. The room fell silent. For the first time since their reunion, Brandon looked uncertain. Joshua let out a quiet breath. I tried to come. Brandon studied his face. For 7 years, Brandon had believed one thing. Joshua had simply abandoned him. But now, for the first time, he was hearing a different story. Joshua met his eyes. I didn't break the promise because I wanted to. His voice was soft. I just couldn't keep it. Brandon didn't respond immediately, because something inside him was beginning to shift. A doubt. A question he had never allowed himself to consider before. What if Joshua had been telling the truth? The silence between them felt different now. Not as cold, not as distant, but the past still stood between them. 7 years of misunderstandings couldn't disappear in a single conversation. Joshua finally spoke again. Do you believe me? Brandon looked away toward the window. The city lights flickered across the skyline. After a long moment, he answered quietly. I don't know. But for the first time in 7 years, Brandon was no longer completely sure that Joshua had betrayed him. And that small crack in the wall he had built around his heart was the beginning of something dangerous. Part 7, Old Feelings. The next morning felt strangely different. Brandon woke up earlier than usual, his mind already busy with thoughts he couldn't ignore. Joshua's words from the night before kept replaying in his head. My father found out about our plan. I tried to come. For 7 years, Brandon had built his life on a single belief, that Joshua had chosen not to show up. That belief had hardened him, made him stronger, made him colder. But now that certainty had started to crack. And Brandon hated uncertainty. He arrived at the office earlier than usual. The project room was empty when he entered. Brandon placed his briefcase on the table and opened the strategy documents they had worked on the previous night. But he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to memories he had buried long ago. The rooftop, the ocean, Joshua's laugh, and the promise they made under the stars. Brandon clenched his jaw slightly. He didn't want to think about those things anymore. But fate seemed determined to drag the past back into his life. The door opened behind him. Joshua walked in. He looked slightly tired, as if he hadn't slept much either. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Joshua offered a small smile. Morning. Brandon nodded. Morning. The simple greeting felt strangely awkward. 7 years ago, they would have started the day teasing each other. Now they spoke like cautious strangers. Joshua placed his laptop on the table. Did you look at the market expansion data? Yes. And? Brandon turned the screen toward him. We should focus on Asia-Pacific growth first. The risk is lower and the return is faster. Joshua leaned closer to look at the numbers. Their shoulders brushed slightly. Both of them froze for a moment. Joshua cleared his throat and stepped back. Good idea, he said quickly. They returned to work. Over the next few hours, their collaboration became surprisingly smooth. Despite the tension between them, their ideas flowed together naturally. Brandon handled long-term investment strategies. Joshua analyzed potential market risks and negotiations. Felt familiar, like they were slipping into an old rhythm they hadn't used in years. At one point, Joshua suddenly laughed quietly. Brandon looked up. "What's funny?" Joshua shook his head. "It's just strange." "What is?" Joshua gestured between them. "We haven't worked together in 7 years, but it still feels like we understand how each other thinks." Brandon didn't respond, but Joshua wasn't wrong. Even now, Brandon could predict Joshua's arguments before he made them, just like Joshua could anticipate Brandon's strategies. Some connections didn't disappear easily. Later that afternoon, they decided to take a short break. Joshua walked toward the window again, staring down at the busy streets far below. The city looked endless from this height. "Do you ever go back?" Joshua asked suddenly. Brandon frowned slightly. "Back where?" "Seabrook." The name felt unfamiliar now. Brandon hadn't spoken it in years. "No," he said calmly. Joshua nodded slowly. "I haven't either." A quiet silence followed. Then Joshua spoke again. "Do you remember the lighthouse?" Brandon stiffened slightly. Of course he remembered. The abandoned lighthouse on the cliffs had been their favorite place when they were younger. They used to climb to the top and watch the ocean together. But Brandon simply said, "That was a long time ago." Joshua turned to face him. "You still avoid talking about it." Brandon's expression hardened slightly. "There's nothing to talk about." Joshua studied him carefully. For years, Joshua had imagined what Brandon might be like now. But seeing him in person was different. Brandon had changed. He was stronger, more confident. But Joshua could still see the quiet boy he used to know hidden beneath that calm exterior. Joshua sighed softly. "You waited for me." Brandon didn't answer, but Joshua already knew the truth. "You waited at the station." Brandon's voice was quiet. "Yes." Joshua felt a sharp pain in his chest. "How long?" Brandon stared at the city outside. "Until the train left." Joshua closed his eyes briefly. He had imagined that moment countless times over the years. Brandon standing alone on the empty platform, waiting. Joshua spoke softly. "I'm sorry." Brandon finally turned to look at him. For a moment their eyes locked. Joshua continued, "I know that apology probably doesn't mean much after 7 years." Brandon didn't say anything. Joshua stepped closer. "But I never forgot that night." His voice was honest. "I thought about it every single year." Brandon's chest tightened slightly. Joshua reached into his briefcase. He pulled out something small and placed it on the table. It was an old photograph. Brandon's eyes widened slightly. The same photograph he had thrown into a drawer years ago. 2 boys standing on a beach, laughing. Joshua spoke quietly. "I kept it." Brandon stared at the picture. Memories rushed back faster than he could stop them. Joshua continued softly, "I never stopped thinking about you either." The room became completely silent. Brandon slowly picked up the photograph. For a moment, the walls he had built around his emotions felt dangerously thin. Joshua watched him carefully. "Do you still hate me?" he asked quietly. Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the photograph back on the table. Then he said something Joshua didn't expect. "I don't know what I feel." And that answer was more honest than either of them expected. Because after 7 years of silence, their story wasn't finished yet. Part 8: The Night of Confessions. The 4th day of the joint project arrived with dark clouds covering the city. Heavy rain began falling early in the morning, turning the streets below into shining rivers of reflected lights. Inside Aurora Holdings headquarters, the atmosphere was quiet. Most employees had already left early because of the storm warning. But Brandon and Joshua remained in the conference room, still working on the final strategy proposal. The room was dim except for the glow of the large screen and the soft lights above the table. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Joshua leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "We've been staring at numbers all day." Brandon didn't look up from his laptop. "We're almost finished." Joshua glanced at the clock. 10:17 p.m. "Almost finished," he repeated with a tired laugh. The storm outside suddenly grew louder. Rain slammed against the windows as lightning flashed across the sky. Joshua stood up and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city. The storm made everything look dramatic, powerful, beautiful. He spoke quietly without turning around. You remember the storms in Seabrook? Brandon paused. Of course he remembered. The storms by the ocean had always been intense. The wind would shake the windows, and the waves would crash against the cliffs like thunder. Joshua continued softly. We used to sit in the lighthouse during storms. Brandon slowly closed his laptop. The memory came back clearly. They would climb the broken stairs of the abandoned lighthouse and sit near the top window, watching the waves crash below. Joshua had always loved storms. Brandon walked toward the window and stood beside him. Yes, he said quietly. Joshua smiled faintly. You used to pretend you weren't scared. Brandon frowned slightly. I wasn't scared. Joshua chuckled. You grabbed my arm every time the thunder hit. Brandon rolled his eyes slightly. That happened once. Joshua turned to face him. Their faces were closer than either of them expected. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm outside lit the room with flashes of white light. Joshua spoke softly. Brandon, why did you agree to run away with me that night? Brandon looked surprised by the question. You were the one who suggested it. Joshua nodded. But you said yes. Brandon hesitated. For years, he had avoided thinking about that answer. But now, standing here again with Joshua, the truth felt impossible to ignore. Because of you, Brandon said quietly. Joshua's eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? Brandon looked away toward the window. You were the only reason I wanted to leave. Joshua felt his heart skip. Brandon continued before he could stop himself. I didn't care about the city. His voice was calm, but the honesty behind it was overwhelming. I just wanted to go somewhere with you. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain. Joshua stared at him. 7 years ago, he had suspected Brandon felt something deeper than friendship. But hearing it now made his chest tighten. Joshua took a slow breath. You know why I asked you to leave with me? Brandon looked back at him. Joshua's voice softened. Because I loved you. The words hung in the air like lightning. For a moment, Brandon couldn't move. Joshua continued quietly. I realized it a few weeks before we made that promise. His eyes were steady. I didn't know how to say it. So I thought maybe if we left together. He stopped. The storm outside crashed loudly. Joshua laughed softly at himself. Turns out I never even made it to the station. Brandon's chest felt tight. 7 years. 7 years of believing Joshua had simply abandoned him. And now he was hearing something completely different. Brandon spoke carefully. Why didn't you tell me back then? Joshua looked down at his hands. I was afraid. Of what? Joshua looked back at him. That you wouldn't feel the same. Brandon let out a quiet breath. Joshua blinked. Wait. His eyes widened slightly. You did feel the same, didn't you? Brandon didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Joshua let out a disbelieving laugh. 7 years. He ran a hand through his hair. 7 years wasted because we were both too stupid to say what we felt. Brandon almost smiled. Almost. But the weight of the past still lingered. Joshua stepped a little closer. So, what do you feel now? The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Brandon looked at him carefully. 7 years ago, Joshua had been the most important person in his life. Seeing him again had reopened wounds Brandon thought had healed. But it had also brought something else back. Something he thought he had buried forever. Brandon spoke honestly. I still don't know. Joshua nodded slowly. That's fair. 7 years of silence couldn't disappear overnight. But at least now the truth had been spoken. And that truth had changed everything. Joshua suddenly smiled slightly. But you don't hate me anymore. Brandon looked at him. After a moment he shook his head. No. Joshua's smile grew softer. That was enough for now. Outside, the storm slowly began to calm. But inside the quiet conference room, something between them had finally begun to heal. Part 9, The Choice. The final day of the project arrived faster than either Brandon or Joshua expected. For the past week, they had worked side by side almost every day. an uneasy partnership built from necessity, rivalry, and a slowly reopening past. The growth strategy they created together had become something impressive. Even the board members reviewing their work seemed surprised by how effective their collaboration was. But today, everything would change. Because after the final presentation, the company would make its decision. Only one firm would win the contract: Sterling Financial, or Aurora Holdings, which meant only one of them would succeed, and the other would walk away empty-handed. The presentation took place in a large executive conference hall. Senior investors and board members filled the long table at the center of the room. Large screens displayed financial projections and strategic plans. Brandon stood at one end of the room. Joshua stood at the other. Both of them looked calm and composed, but the tension between them was undeniable. The presentation began. Brandon spoke first, explaining the long-term investment strategy his company proposed. His voice was confident and controlled, his explanations precise. When he finished, Joshua stepped forward. He presented Aurora Holdings' strategy, an aggressive expansion plan with higher risks but potentially greater rewards. The two strategies were completely different, and both were powerful. The board members exchanged thoughtful looks as they listened. After the presentations ended, the room fell silent. One of the senior board directors leaned forward. "Both proposals are excellent." Another member nodded. "Your companies clearly have exceptional leadership." The first director continued. "However, only one company can receive the contract." Everyone in the room understood the weight of those words. The director looked at Brandon and Joshua. "We will announce the final decision shortly." The board members left the room to discuss privately. Executives and observers slowly began leaving the hall as well. Soon, only Brandon and Joshua remained. The large room felt strangely quiet. Joshua loosened his tie slightly. "Well," he said with a small smile, "this is it." Brandon nodded. "Yes." Joshua walked toward the window overlooking the city. "You know something strange?" he said. Brandon glanced at him. "What?" Joshua chuckled quietly. 7 years ago, I thought the biggest decision of my life was whether to run away with you." Brandon didn't respond immediately. Joshua continued. "Now we're standing here competing for a contract worth millions." He turned around. "Life is weird." Brandon allowed himself a faint smile. "Yes." For a moment they simply stood there. Then Joshua spoke more seriously. "Brandon, can I ask you something?" "What?" Joshua took a breath. "If you win today, what happens next?" Brandon frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Joshua shrugged. "After this project is over, we'll probably go back to being rivals." The thought felt heavier than Brandon expected. Joshua continued quietly. "We might not see each other again." That possibility hung in the air. Brandon realized something uncomfortable. The idea of not seeing Joshua again felt wrong. Joshua watched his expression carefully. 7 years ago," Joshua said softly, "we didn't even get a chance to try." Brandon looked at him. Joshua's voice grew more serious. "I don't want to lose that chance again." Brandon's chest tightened slightly. Joshua stepped closer. "I know things aren't simple between us. 7 years of pain. 7 years of misunderstandings. 7 years of silence." But Joshua continued anyway. "Still, if we get another chance." He hesitated for a moment. "Would you take it?" Brandon stared at him. The question was simple, but the answer carried the weight of their entire past. For years, Brandon had convinced himself that the chapter with Joshua was finished. But the past week had proven something different. The feelings he thought he had buried had never truly disappeared. Brandon spoke quietly. "I waited for you once." Joshua's expression softened. "And I never stopped regretting that I didn't make it." The silence between them felt fragile. Joshua stepped closer. Now they stood only a few feet apart. "Then maybe we should stop letting the past decide everything." Brandon studied his face. The same boy he had once trusted more than anyone else. Just older now, wiser, and still standing in front of him. Before Brandon could respond, the conference room doors opened. The board members returned. The final decision had been made. The director at the front cleared his throat. "Thank you for your patience." Brandon and Joshua both turned toward the table. The director continued, "After reviewing both proposals carefully, the entire room felt tense. The director looked directly at them. The contract will be awarded to." The moment hung in the air. Neither Brandon nor Joshua spoke. But both of them understood something important. Winning the contract might change their careers. But it wasn't the most important decision they were facing anymore. Because the real choice wasn't about business. It was about whether they would finally stop running from the feelings they had left unresolved for 7 years. And that answer would come very soon. Part 10: The Promise We Never Finished. The conference room was completely silent. Every person in the room waited as the director prepared to announce the final decision. Brandon stood calmly beside the table, his expression controlled like always. Joshua stood across from him, arms loosely crossed, though the tension in his shoulders was obvious. The director finally spoke. After careful evaluation of both proposals, he glanced at the documents in front of him. "The contract will be awarded to Sterling Financial Group." For a brief moment, no one reacted. Then quiet applause filled the room. Executives from Brandon's company congratulated each other. Several investors stood up to shake Brandon's hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Lee. Excellent presentation. Well deserved." Brandon nodded politely as he accepted the praise. But his attention drifted elsewhere. Across the room, Joshua stood quietly. Aurora Holdings had lost. Joshua maintained a professional expression, but Brandon could see the disappointment behind his calm face. After all, Joshua had worked just as hard for this project. Eventually, the meeting ended. People began leaving the room, discussing the outcome. Within minutes, the large conference hall became quiet again. Only Brandon and Joshua remained. Joshua walked slowly toward the table, gathering his documents. "Well," he said lightly, though his voice carried a hint of exhaustion. "Looks like you won." Brandon studied him carefully. "You deserved it too." Joshua shrugged. "That's business." He slipped the papers into his briefcase. "For what it's worth, it was a good competition." Brandon nodded slightly. Yes. For a moment, the two of them simply stood there. 7 years ago, they had parted without saying goodbye. Now another ending stood in front of them. Joshua finally broke the silence. "So this is probably where we go our separate ways again." Brandon's chest tightened slightly. Joshua continued, forcing a small smile. "You'll go back to running your company, and I'll go back to competing against you." He looked at Brandon. "Maybe we'll see each other at another negotiation meeting someday." The words sounded casual, but something about them felt final. Joshua picked up his briefcase. "Well, goodbye, Brandon." He turned toward the door, but before he could leave, Joshua stopped. He turned around slowly. Brandon stood a few steps away now. Something about his expression had changed. Joshua frowned slightly. "What is it?" Brandon spoke carefully. 7 years ago." Joshua listened quietly. "You asked me to run away with you." Joshua's eyes softened. "Yes." Brandon took another step forward. "You asked me because you loved me." Joshua's heart began beating faster. "And I said yes," Brandon continued. Joshua nodded slowly. "You did." Brandon's voice lowered. "But we never finished that promise." Joshua stared at him. For years, he had imagined hearing something like this, but he had never truly believed it would happen. Brandon continued quietly. 7 years ago, we didn't get the chance to try." Joshua took a slow breath. "And now?" Brandon looked directly at him. The walls he had built around himself for so many years finally seemed to fall away. "Now we do." Joshua's expression softened. "You're serious?" Brandon nodded once. "I don't want another 7 years of silence." Joshua let out a quiet laugh of disbelief. "You know, I was starting to think you'd never say something like that." Brandon raised an eyebrow slightly. "You talk too much." Joshua smiled. That same familiar smile Brandon remembered from their teenage years. Joshua stepped closer. So what are you saying exactly? Brandon held his gaze. I'm saying. He hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke the truth he had buried for years. I loved you too. Joshua's breath caught. The words felt unreal. 7 years late, but still powerful enough to shake his heart. Joshua shook his head slightly. You really waited 7 years to say that? Brandon shrugged faintly. I had to be sure. Joshua laughed softly. You're unbelievable. They stood there for a moment, closer now than they had been in years. Joshua spoke again, quieter this time. So what happens now? Brandon thought about it for a moment. Then he said something that made Joshua's heart skip. Do you remember the train station? Joshua smiled faintly. How could I forget? Brandon continued. There's a train that leaves the city every night at midnight. Joshua's eyes widened slightly. You're kidding. Brandon shook his head. We never took that trip. Joshua laughed. You want to run away again? Brandon looked at him calmly. Yes. Joshua stared at him for a moment. Then he shook his head with a smile. 7 years ago, you were the cautious one. Brandon shrugged slightly. People change. Joshua studied him carefully. Then he said the words that had once started everything. Midnight. Brandon nodded. Midnight. Joshua grinned. Then I'll see you there. This time, neither of them planned to miss it. Epilogue back to Seabrook. The train ride felt strangely familiar. Joshua sat by the window, watching the scenery pass by as the city slowly faded into open countryside. Tall buildings became small towns, highways turned into quiet roads, and eventually the endless blue of the ocean appeared on the horizon. It had been 7 years. 7 years since either of them had seen Seabrook. Joshua glanced across the train compartment. Brandon sat calmly in the seat opposite him, reading through something on his tablet. Even on a weekend trip, he still looked like the composed executive everyone in the business world respected. Joshua smiled slightly. Some things never changed. You're working on vacation? Joshua asked. Brandon didn't look up. I'm not working. Joshua leaned over slightly. You're literally reviewing a financial report. Brandon finally closed the tablet and set it aside. It's a habit. Joshua laughed. You've become such a serious person. Brandon raised an eyebrow. And you haven't? Joshua leaned back in his seat. I prefer the term charmingly reckless. Brandon almost smiled. The train finally slowed as it approached the small station. Joshua felt his chest tighten slightly. The platform looked exactly the same. The same metal benches. The same old lights. The same quiet feeling. Seabrook had barely changed at all. The train doors opened. Joshua stepped off first. For a moment he simply stood there. The same place. The same platform. But a completely different life. 7 years ago he had imagined Brandon standing here alone. Waiting. That memory had haunted him for years. Now Brandon stepped down from the train behind him. Joshua turned around slowly. You know, this is the first time I've been here since that night. Brandon looked around the station quietly. So it seems. Joshua shoved his hands into his pockets. I used to think about this place a lot. Brandon glanced at him. Me too. Joshua looked surprised. You do? Brandon nodded slightly. For a long time, I hated it. Joshua's smile faded. That makes sense. Brandon continued. But now it just feels like a memory. Joshua looked around the station again. The past didn't feel as heavy anymore. Not when Brandon was standing beside him. Joshua suddenly pointed toward the street. Come on. Brandon frowned slightly. Where? Joshua grinned. There's somewhere we have to go. 20 minutes later, they stood at the edge of the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The old lighthouse was still there, weathered, quiet, exactly the way they remembered it. The wind blew through the lighthouse again. Joshua turned slightly toward him. Do you regret anything? Brandon thought about the question. 7 years of silence. 7 years of misunderstanding. 7 years lost. But then he looked at Joshua, standing here, alive, still smiling. Brandon shook his head. No. Joshua's expression softened. Me neither. They stood there quietly as the sun began to set over the ocean. The sky slowly turned shades of gold and orange. Joshua spoke again. You know what's funny? Brandon looked at him. What? Joshua grinned. We never actually ran away together. Brandon considered that. Then he said calmly, we still could. Joshua blinked. Are you serious? Brandon shrugged slightly. There's another train tonight. Joshua laughed. You're unbelievable. Brandon looked at him. But this time, Joshua waited. Brandon finished quietly. We're not running away from anything. Joshua's smile softened. Then what are we doing? Brandon looked out at the horizon. Starting over. Joshua looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yeah. Starting over sounded perfect. Because this time, neither of them planned to miss the train. The end.
If you like the story, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications for more amazing stories.